There is a moment in the life of an empath that almost no one sees coming. It doesn't arrive with anger. It doesn't arrive with shouting or revenge. In fact, it arrives so quietly that most people mistake it for calm. But what they don't realize is that something irreversible has just happened. The empath has stopped forgiving. For years, sometimes decades, the empath has been the emotional backbone of everyone around them. They are the one who understands when others refuse to listen, the one who absorbs tension when everyone else walks away, the one who forgives behavior that would break most people. They tell themselves stories to justify the pain. They didn't mean it. They're just going through something. If I'm patient, things will change. And so they keep giving, they keep understanding, they keep forgiving. But slowly, something begins to shift inside. Not bitterness, not hatred, something far deeper, awareness. The empath starts noticing patterns. The same apologies repeated again and again. The same disrespect wrapped in different excuses. The same emotional wounds that never truly heal because the person causing them never truly changes. And suddenly the empath realizes a painful truth. Their kindness has been mistaken for permission. This is the moment the inner awakening begins. The renowned psychologist Carl Jung spoke about the hidden side of human nature, the shadow. The shadow is everything people hide about themselves, their selfishness, their insecurity, their manipulation, their fear of being exposed. Most people spend their lives protecting that shadow behind social masks, smiles, politeness, false loyalty, carefully crafted identities, and without realizing it, empaths become the perfect place for these shadows to hide. Why? Because the empath forgives. They absorb the emotional damage instead of confronting it. They smooth over conflict instead of exposing it. Their compassion becomes a shield that protects everyone else's darkness from being seen. But when the empath stops forgiving endlessly, something extraordinary happens. The shield disappears, and suddenly people are forced to face themselves. The friend who once relied on your understanding becomes defensive. The partner who expected unlimited patience becomes angry. The family member who demanded loyalty begins accusing you of changing. They say things like, "You're not the same anymore. You've become cold. You used to understand me." But here is the truth they don't want to admit. You didn't become cold. You became aware. For the first time, you stopped carrying emotional burdens that were never yours. For the first time, you stopped protecting people from the consequences of their own behavior. And the moment that happens, every illusion begins to crack. Because the reality is this: some people were never attached to your love. They were attached to your tolerance. They were comfortable as long as you kept forgiving, kept adjusting, kept sacrificing your peace to maintain their comfort. But the moment that cycle breaks, their true character begins to surface. This is the dark psychological turning point that Jung warned about. When consciousness grows, illusions cannot survive, and that moment is terrifying, not for the empath, but for everyone who depended on the empath's silence. Because now the empath sees clearly. They see the subtle manipulation hidden in jokes, the guilt disguised as concern, the emotional dependency disguised as love. Patterns that once seemed normal now become impossible to ignore, and something powerful happens inside the empath's mind. The endless emotional noise fades. For years, their thoughts were filled with other people's feelings, other people's expectations, other people's problems. But when the empath stops forgiving automatically, space finally appears in their mind. Space for clarity, space for truth, space for self-respect. And with that clarity comes a realization that changes everything. You were never meant to carry everyone's darkness. Your empathy was never meant to be a prison. It was meant to be a gift. But a gift becomes destructive when it is given to those who only know how to take. So the empath begins to do something they once feared more than anything. They step back, not out of hatred, but out of awakening. And the silence that follows becomes louder than any argument ever could. Because when the empath stops forgiving blindly, the world around them is forced to reveal what it truly is. Every mask begins to slip. Every hidden intention begins to surface. And for the first time in their life, the empath realizes something incredibly powerful. Walking away from endless forgiveness is not the loss of compassion. It is the birth of self-respect. The moment an empath stops forgiving everything, the entire emotional landscape around them begins to shift. It's as if a hidden current in their life suddenly reverses direction. For years, energy flowed outward, toward other people's problems, other people's emotions, other people's chaos. The empath became the stabilizer, the emotional shock absorber, the silent healer in rooms full of wounded people. But when that endless forgiveness finally reaches its limit, something remarkable happens. The empath begins to draw a line, not a loud, dramatic line, not one built from anger or revenge. Instead, it's a quiet but unshakable boundary, a moment where the empath internally decides, I will not abandon myself anymore. And the instant that boundary appears, people begin to reveal who they truly are. This is where the deep psychological insight of Carl Jung becomes impossible to ignore. Jung believed that much of human behavior is shaped by the unconscious, the hidden motivations and shadows people refuse to confront. Most individuals prefer to live comfortably behind their social masks. They smile, they charm, they play roles that make them appear kind, loyal, or supportive. But those masks survive only under certain conditions. They survive when no one challenges them. For years, the empath unknowingly allowed these masks to remain intact. By forgiving endlessly, by smoothing over conflict, by prioritizing harmony over truth, the empath created an environment where people never had to face themselves. They could apologize without changing. They could promise without delivering. They could hurt without consequences. But the moment boundaries appear, that entire system collapses. Because boundaries introduce something many people secretly fear: accountability. Suddenly, manipulation stops working. Guilt no longer controls the empath's decisions. Emotional pressure loses its power, and people who once felt comfortable leaning on the empath's patience begin to panic. You'll notice it in subtle ways at first. Someone becomes irritated when you say no. Someone questions your loyalty when you refuse to sacrifice your peace. Someone accuses you of becoming distant simply because you no longer tolerate the same behavior. This reaction reveals an uncomfortable truth. Some people were never attached to your kindness. They were attached to your compliance. But the empath, who has awakened, sees through this illusion. They begin recognizing patterns they once ignored. Conversations that once drained them now feel transparent. Compliments that once seemed sincere now reveal hidden expectations. The emotional games that once and fuse them suddenly become obvious. And as this clarity grows, something extraordinary begins to happen inside the empath's mind. Their energy starts returning. For years, their attention was scattered across countless emotional responsibilities that were never truly theirs. They monitored moods, anticipated reactions, tried to prevent conflict before it started. Their mind was constantly scanning the emotional environment like a radar system designed to protect everyone else. But boundaries change that. Boundaries redirect energy inward, and the moment that happens, The empath experiences a transformation that Jung described as the beginning of individuation, the process of becoming the person you were always meant to be. Individuation is not comfortable. It is not easy. In fact, it often requires disappointing people who were accustomed to your self-sacrifice. But it is one of the most powerful psychological evolutions a human being can experience. Because when the empath begins reclaiming their energy, they also reclaim their identity. They begin asking you questions they may have avoided for years. What do I actually want? What kind of people truly deserve my presence? What kind of life feels peaceful instead of exhausting? And as those questions grow stronger, the empath's behavior begins to change in ways that surprise everyone around them. They stop explaining themselves endlessly. They stop chasing approval. They stop apologizing for protecting their peace. Instead, they start observing, watching. They see who respects their boundaries and who tries to push past them. They see who adapts with understanding and who reacts with anger. And this observation reveals something incredibly valuable. The right people do not fear your growth. They welcome it. They respect your limits. They appreciate your honesty. They understand that real relationships are built on mutual respect, not emotional dependency. But those who depended on your unlimited forgiveness often reveal a different side. When they realize they can no longer control the emotional dynamic, their frustration becomes visible. The mask slips, and their true nature steps forward. And while this can feel painful at first, it is also liberating. Because clarity is power. For the first time, the empath is no longer guessing who truly values them. The truth becomes visible through action, through reactions, through the way people respond to boundaries. And with that clarity comes a quiet but unstoppable confidence. The empath no longer feels responsible for everyone's happiness. They no longer carry guilt for protecting their peace. They understand something that once seemed impossible to accept. Not every relationship is meant to survive your growth. Some people were only meant to meet the version of you who kept forgiving everything, but the version of you who finally respects themselves. That version requires something different, respect. When the empath finally awakens, the transformation is not loud, dramatic, or chaotic. It is something far more powerful. It is a quiet shift in the soul that changes the entire direction of their life. For years they lived in survival mode, absorbing emotions, diffusing conflict, sacrificing peace in the hope that kindness would eventually heal everything around them. But awakening reveals a truth that many people spend their entire lives avoiding. Compassion without boundaries slowly destroys the person who gives it. And once that realization takes root, the empath begins evolving into something stronger than they ever imagined. This is the moment where the deeper psychological insight of Carl Jung becomes real. Jung believed that true strength comes from integrating the parts of our selves we once feared. The shadow is not just darkness or cruelty. It is the hidden power we suppress because we are afraid of becoming too much, too assertive, too honest, too unwilling to tolerate disrespect. Empaths often suppress this part of themselves because they fear hurting others. They fear conflict. They fear becoming like the people who once caused them pain. So they bury their anger. They silence their instincts. They choose understanding even when their own spirit is quietly breaking. But awakening changes that. The empath begins to understand that strength and compassion are not enemies. In fact, they must exist together. Compassion without strength invites exploitation. Strength without compassion becomes cruelty. But when both are balanced, something extraordinary emerges. Clarity. And clarity is one of the most powerful forces a human being can possess. The awakened empath no longer moves through life trying to rescue everyone. They begin to see people exactly as they are, not as the potential they once hoped for. They understand that not everyone is ready to grow, not everyone is willing to face their own shadow, and not everyone deserves unlimited access to their heart. This realization is not bitter, it is liberating. For the first time, the empath stops pouring their energy into emotional black holes, situations where love is taken but never returned, where effort is expected but never appreciated. Instead, they begin investing their energy where it actually matters, into their peace, into their growth, into relationships built on mutual respect rather than emotional dependency. And when this shift happens, people around them begin to notice something different. The empath, who once explained themselves endlessly, now speaks with calm certainty. The empath, who once tolerated disrespect, now walks away without drama. The empath, who once tried to fix everyone, now understands a powerful truth. People change only when they choose to change. Not when you sacrifice yourself to save them. This new awareness gives the empath a quiet but undeniable authority. They are no longer easily manipulated by guilt or emotional pressure. They recognize the subtle tactics that once confused them. The passive-aggressive comments, the attempts to trigger sympathy, the emotional games designed to pull them back into old patterns. But now those tactics fall flat, because the empath has finally discovered something stronger than the need for approval. Self-respect, and self-respect changes everything. It changes how they speak. It changes who they allow into their lives. It changes the energy they bring into every room they enter. Instead of trying to earn their place in the world, they begin to understand that their presence itself has value. They no longer chase connection, they attract it, because the people who belong in their life will not fear their boundaries, they will not resent their growth, they will not demand that the empath shrink back into the version of themselves that was easier to control. The right people will recognize the strength behind the kindness. They will respect the balance between empathy and self-protection. And those relationships will feel different, lighter, calmer, honest in ways the empath may have never experienced before. But perhaps the most powerful transformation of all happens internally. For years, the empath carried a quiet fear, the fear that if they stopped forgiving, if they stopped giving endlessly, they might lose everyone. They might end up alone. They might become something cold or unrecognizable. But awakening reveals the opposite. When you stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable, you don't lose your humanity. You finally reclaim it. You become someone who loves deeply but wisely. Someone who helps others without destroying their own peace. Someone who understands that protecting your spirit is not selfish. It is necessary. This is the dark power Jung hinted at, the power that emerges when compassion and shadow finally stand side by side. The awakened empath is no longer fragile. They are focused. They are aware. And most importantly, they are free. Free from the pressure to fix every broken person who crosses their path. Free from the guilt that once forced them to tolerate what their soul knew was wrong. Free to build a life filled with people who see their kindness not as weakness, but as strength. And that is the moment everything changes. Because when an empath truly awakens, they stop trying to save the world and start choosing a world that deserves them.